Hey guys, it's Kevin, my review for Deadpool and Wolverine. And this film, of course, we are centering back on the character of Wade Wilson, but he's kind of in a different phase in his life. He's kind of put the days of Deadpool behind him, and he's trying to settle more into just civilian life at this point, but he ends up getting pulled back in from the TVA, who tell him about a mission of sorts that he needs to go on that might be a potential deadly threat to his entire world, and the only way to potentially save it is to pull in Wolverine, and basically the two of them then have to go on this mission to try to save humanity. However, that becomes a bit more complicated when the Wolverine that Wade ends up recruiting happens to be the worst Wolverine in the entire universe. And look, I don't think I need to really get into this film all that much. This is easily the most anticipated film of the year for many people. It's not my most anticipated film of the year. It's definitely up there. Like, it was, I made like a top 20 list, and it was like towards the bottom half, but it was still very much in there. But no question about it, this is easily like the biggest film of the year. I'm sure everyone's just been waiting for this. And, you know, when it came to me, I was really excited. I love the first two Deadpool movies. I love how self-referential they are, but I also love how just unapologetically silly and overly raunchy they are, and how they're able to find a way to have these really ridiculous elements, but also incorporate this sense of seriousness and tell this really great story. The second film in particular, I think, really furthered Wade's character in such an interesting direction. What's interesting about Deadpool 2 is that it's a film that came out like right when the Fox acquisition was like first coming to fruition. This was like one of the first things we heard about, that it was probably going to be one of the last projects within like the Fox universe and things like that. And, you know, we haven't heard anything about Deadpool since then, and I really didn't know what the future of this character was going to be. I was just really hoping when Disney did acquire Fox that they were going to find a way to still implement Deadpool, because I knew that there was still a lot more room for this character and what they were able to do with him. And when they announced they were doing a Deadpool 3, I was really excited to see how it was going to turn out. And then they made the announcement about Wolverine and Hugh Jackman coming out, and I was very reluctant. I didn't really know how to fully feel about it, but I was excited to see what they were going to do. The potential of these two characters teaming up and things like that, I thought seemed like a really fun idea and kind of a cool way to usher them into the, into the MCU and things like that. I thought that could have been really cool to see, but I also wasn't entirely sure how it was all going to work out. Were they going to fit in? And then they made the announcement of Hugh Jackman returning as Wolverine and him being in this film, and I really just didn't know how to feel about it. Logan was just such a perfect send-off for that character. One of the best and most definitive send-offs I think we've ever had for any character in a franchise. And I mean, especially rewatching it, I mean, it just is the perfect way to wrap things up. I don't know why you would ever want to play that character again after such an amazing conclusion like the one we get there. But I was open to the idea of, you know, getting to see these two interact and the possibilities of things that we really haven't gotten to see from Wolverine before, and also the fact that, you know, this is now in the MCU and there's a lot more you can do with both of these characters that we just haven't been able to see them do before because of rights and things like that, and now we can see them do those things. This is, in fact, the only MCU film that we're getting this year, so I was really hoping this film would deliver. The marketing, I thought, what has been really great, very simplistically showing, like, what this film was going to be, getting us to understand, you know, what it was really all about, but also just showing that the, like, very irreverent and, you know, very adult nature of these films really hasn't gone away, and so I was really hoping this film would deliver. And I will say this, while I don't think this film is the complete home run that so many have been hoping for and many proclaiming that it was for the MCU, I still think the Deadpool Wolverine is just a very fun and just gleefully entertaining film that just does such a great job of reminding us what works so well with this character and really just putting a big ol' smile on my face. But we are just getting into it right now. And look, I think when it comes to the performances in this film, that is absolutely one of the biggest draws going into this movie, and I think it's something that a lot of people aren't going to be expecting anything less than great from, and thankfully, both of them really do end up delivering when talking about Ryan Reynolds. I mean, look, he was born to play Deadpool. He always has been so great as this character. The one-liners, the irreverence, constant shots he takes at everyone, and how relentless he is in that way. All of that is still retained here, and I think he does a really good job. But he also shows a little bit more growth from Wade. He's kind of in a different place in his life in this movie, and I think that's something that Reynolds did a really good job with showing that, you know, still capturing the spirit and the mannerisms of Deadpool, but also showcasing a slightly older Deadpool who's in a different phase in his life, and I think he does do a pretty good job with that. And I think just the fact that he was able to get to play this character again after everything that happened at the Fox merger, I think is something that we should just be very grateful for. And look, as long as Reynolds is willing to continue to do more as this character, I will be there day one, because I am just continually just so impressed by what he is able to accomplish in these films, and really just never missing a beat in, you know, what he is trying to do. And I think always just continuing to entertain as this character and really just playing to his strengths, and I think he continues to do that here. But it's Hugh Jackman who really just blew me away in this movie in a way that I honestly shouldn't have been that surprised by, because look, it's Hugh Jackman. He's one of the best actors working today, but also, I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say his portrayal of Wolverine is hands down one of the best in any comic book film that's out there, and it's the kind of role that he just continues to excel in. But considering that he had, you know, hung up his shield as that character, and he kind of was done, or claws rather, as that character, you know, he could have easily given a performance that felt kind of phoned in and kind of not as just not as enthusiastic as we're used to. But he gets right back into it, and I think gives one of the best performances we have seen from him to date. You can just tell how much fun he is having throughout this entire movie. He gets to do things with the Wolverine character that he really hasn't gotten to do before, but also still leaning into the emotional heights of this character and what he has really been through. This is obviously a Logan that we have not seen before, and he really just does a great job of getting us to fully understand him, seeing how this is someone who is so incredibly bitter and disillusioned, and what's really gotten him to this point, and adding layers to him that I think we simply would not have been able to have if Jackman wasn't fully into, you know, fully buying into everything he's supposed to do with this character, and really just doing such an amazing job, and showing that despite the fact that, you know, I didn't necessarily love the idea of Hugh Jackman coming back, it kind of shows that maybe he really is the only person to play this character, because even so many years into it, after, you know, deciding to be done with the character as Logan, he still hasn't missed a beat, and I was just so impressed by what he was able to do. There's one scene especially with him in the car and him kind of lecturing Wade and the choices that he's made, and look, Jackman's given great performances as this character before, but that absolutely has to be one of the best moments he's ever given us as this character. And I think it's one of those things where, like, we know how good Hugh Jackman is in this role, but I think there was a worry that he was maybe, because of the fact that Logan was supposed to be his last performance as this character, that he was going to be a bit more on autopilot here, but he really just steps right back into it, and scenes like that are really exemplified as to why. And while I don't think it's the best work that Jackman has given, I don't think he's ever topping Logan. I just don't think that's ever going to happen. His work in that film was just absolutely extraordinary. It still is a very impressive performance with what he is able to do here. Remember, this is not a Wolverine that we have seen before, and it could have been very easy for him to just kind of be a bit more on autopilot here and not really put in as much effort. But gratefully, he gets right back into the character, really having never missed a beat, and really just channeling a different side of Wolverine that we haven't seen before. And while I'm not entirely sure if we're going to see this iteration of Wolverine again, Jackman's performance is just so incredibly impressive here that he's able so far into his career still deliver the way that we are hoping him to, and putting so much effort in, that it just might be enough to potentially win me over to the idea of him being the definitive Wolverine. Like I said, I don't know what the MCU has planned moving forward, but for what was something that I was very conflicted with, he delivered so much more than I ever really could have expected him to. when it comes to the chemistry between these two, I mean, it is absolutely electric. I think the two of them just absolutely bring out the best in each other. The just really snarky and obnoxious nature of Deadpool contrasted with the much more hardened and abrasive nature of Wolverine, the way they're able to, and the way they're able to mix that together in such a effortless way, I think just works so well in this movie. The both of them are really just at the top of their game. You can tell how much fun they're having. Obviously, Jackman and Reynolds are friends in real life, and that very much does help, but also their chemistry is just so incredibly on point here. I love the way they were able to bounce off each other, but also, again, just bring something to bring a dynamic to both of these characters that we just haven't really gotten to see before, and I think that is easily one of the best aspects of this entire film. I think if these two were not on their A game and not willing to fully buy into all the lunacy, I don't think this film would work nearly as well as it does, but thankfully the two of them just really end up going for it, giving truly just incredible performances, and I think even if you don't like this movie, I think that is going to be a highlight regardless. Just seeing these two continually just excel at these characters, but also pushing themselves to their limits in a way that we haven't seen before. I think they both just do such an incredible job here, and I was so impressed by both their performances in this film. They're easily one of the best aspects of this movie. And then everyone else in this movie, there's not really a ton to say performance-wise because the two of them really are just the co-leads of this movie. Everyone else is kind of supporting, and there's some people in this film that I absolutely cannot talk about and will not do, obviously, but the ones that I can talk about, Emma Corrin, I thought was very good here as Cassandra Nova, who is one of the two antagonists in this movie. I've enjoyed them in a majority of stuff, but I really enjoyed their performance in this film. We'll talk about Cassandra Nova as a antagonist in a bit, but I think that they are able to add layers to this character, but also just really lean into the sinister nature of this character really well, and I think that they ended up heightening the impact of this character as a result. Like I said, I'll talk about the character in a bit, but I think their performance was very effective, and every time they were on screen, they definitely added to the tension and what was, and just the overall, like I said, sort of very menacing nature of that character. I think they did a really good job here. And then Matthew Macfadyen, similar to Hugh Jackman, I think he's just having such a grand old time in this movie. He really does such a great job at playing this character, Mr. Paradox, who's so incredibly smarmy, but also has this very, petrified type nature to him, and I think he's just really fun to watch. Mr. Paradox, as a character, again, we'll talk about him in a little bit, but he has his own sort of plans of sorts, and I think Faden does a good job of kind of just showing, again, just how sort of manipulative this character is, but also showing how, at the end of the day, how scared he is of what's going on, and I think that overall he did do a really good job here. And that the only other performance I do want to mention in terms of the previous Deadpool actors we get is Rob Delaney, who has a lot more to work with in this movie than he did in the second one as Peter, and I just really enjoyed him a lot in this film. I loved him in the second movie, but here I think we really just get to see how well Peter fits into all of this, and by the end of the movie, I mean, similar to as long as Reynolds is on board, I will be on board. As long as Peter is also included in whatever Deadpool is doing, I will also be on board, because he is just as integral to Deadpool's characters as Wade is, and I just really enjoyed seeing his inclusion in the film. Overall, I thought all the performances were really good here, as usual. Alright, but now let's get to the directing and the writing, which I do want to talk about Shawn Levy as a director. I've seen a lot of people say that they don't really like him that much as a director, but I've really enjoyed all of the previous works he's done. I really enjoyed Free Guy. I really like the Adam Project. He's done a couple episodes of Stranger Things. I think overall he's a very capable director, and while I don't think he necessarily has a style of his own, I couldn't necessarily tell you what does a Shawn Levy project look like, I do think he still does a really good job of really just doing a great job of leaning into all of the outrageousness of what we've seen from the previous Deadpool films, but also adding his own spin to it. The film feels a little bit more sincere than the others that we've gotten. It does a good job of combining, but I think he does a good job of recognizing what worked in the previous Deadpool films. Like I said, the hilarity is very much still there. This film is frequently funny, and I was laughing This film is very funny, and I was laughing quite frequently throughout this film, and I think he does a good job with that. But also knowing when to add a bit more emotion to the film, I think he does a really good job there as well. But also adding this grander sense to the movie. You know, the first two films, they feel like this small sort of pockets of their universe, and they feel a lot more smaller scale in that way. And that's something I really enjoy about the first two films. But this film obviously is a lot bigger, and I think Levy does a good job of just really showing how much bigger it really is and really capturing that sort of grandiose feel of this movie. I think he did do a really good job with that. So overall, I really did enjoy his directing here. Like I said, I don't think it was quite as polished as we saw with like Tim Miller in the first movie, or even David Leitch in the second film. I thought did a better job, but I still thought his directing was pretty good here. But then we get to the writing in this movie, and this is really the aspect of the film that I am the most conflicted with, because I will be honest with you guys, when I first saw this movie, I really didn't know how to feel about it. There were a lot of things that I liked, but there were also a lot of things that I didn't, and my thoughts were just so all over the place when it came to this film that I knew I had to see it a second time, and that kind of got me to appreciate quite a few elements a bit more than I did. And for one, I mean, something I think they do a really good job with in this movie is how they end up, making all of this work. There's a lot of things this film has to do that the previous two Deadpool films didn't, and this movie is well aware of that. Not only are we trying to follow the characters from the previous Deadpool films, but we are also trying to, integrate Deadpool into the MCU, but also do a really good job of honoring the Fox universe, and the latter of which I think especially it does a really good job with. I really enjoyed the way this film kind of paid as this loving tribute to the Fox films that we aren't going to see anymore, and I thought that they did a really good job with that, much more than I expect them. I expected for the film to be just kind of very sort of cynical about it, and again, they do it in a much more sincere fashion than I was expecting them to, and I think that part of the film actually does work out really well. For one, I mean, the way that these two characters interact is really everything that you really could hope for. They do such a great job of just showcasing how different the two of them are, but also the similarities between the two of them. The two of them are facing very similar conflicts in the movie, and when the film is centering just on their banter and trying to help each other through their respective conflicts, I think the movie is very successful at doing that, and I think that's something that I was definitely very impressed by in this film, and I think that the story works out really well, particularly when it comes to Wolverine's character. I think they give him a surprising amount of depth for a character that we have not seen before. There is a lot of emotional baggage that he has gone through. He's kind of, from the trailers, you've seen it, he's kind of become this social pariah of sorts, and there's a big reasoning for why he is the way that he is, and I think the movie does a really good job of really leaning into his regrets as a person and what's really led him to this point and why he has become the way that he is, why he is so bitter towards everyone and so standoffish in that way. I think the movie does a really great job of leaning into that, and I was honestly really impressed by what they did with him as a character, and it's easily, I think, the strongest part of this movie if we're talking from a writing standpoint. If we're not talking about all the great in-jokes and things like that, which, like I said, it is still great. The social commentary, all of that is still fantastic. I think what they do with Wolverine's character in this movie, I thought was just really, they did end up going the extra mile with him in a way that I wasn't expecting them to. I really like the way they dive deep into his character and what he's really going through, but also presenting a different side that we hadn't gotten to see before. I thought that they did a really good job with that. It is really hard to bring a character back after they have been, effectively killed and, find a way to get people back on board with the idea of even having that actor back in the movie. It's a whole other to have a completely different version of that character played by the same actor, and I think they honestly did accomplish it in the best possible way that they could, and that's something that I was honestly really pleased by. Another big thing I think that has to be addressed here that I think a lot of people were worried about is how they were going to handle Logan, like the movie Logan and things like that? Were they going to pay tribute to it respectfully? And I was someone who always was saying that, like, bringing Hugh Jackman back is not going to ruin the legacy of Logan. They're going to handle that as respectfully as they can. And while there's definitely some things they do here that I absolutely was not expecting them to do, I do think for the most part they do what they can to pay tribute to that film and do it in a pretty respectful and very delicate manner, and they don't really try to do anything to completely, like, desecrate the legacy of that character. So overall, while there definitely were some things that I, at first, when I saw the movie, I wasn't really crazy about, the second time I saw it, I was honestly a lot more on board with it, and I don't really think there's anything here where you watch it and it feels like you watch Logan and the film has now cheapened that movie. I really think they did a good job in finding a way to keep that film and not try to tamper with it too much, but I think they did a pretty good job with that here overall. And I'll get the obvious things out of the way. The satirical nature of these films has always been really great, but this film obviously dives so much further into that because there's so much more for them to work with, whether it's them making fun of, you know, the MCU and where they're at, or making fun of the Fox universe and things like that, or making fun of other things that have gone on, you know, superhero culture wise. I think the movie does do a good job of, similar to the first two films, not really pulling any punches and making sure that nothing really is off limits, and that's something I've always enjoyed about these films, and this film just dives further into that. But it also actually does it much more lovingly and sincerely than I was expecting, particularly when it comes to the Fox universe of sorts. The movie almost can be seen as this tribute to the universe that no longer is around. There were obviously a lot of films that were, you know, part of that studio, or maybe were going to be made and weren't anymore, and the film does a really good job of kind of diving further into that, and I really did enjoy that. And obviously I can't get into it too much without talking about spoilers, but I really did like the way the movie found a way to toe the line between let's make fun of the film, but also let's not be too cynical and feel like we are punching down on a studio that isn't around anymore and had to have all these different films suspend. I think they did it in a very respectful manner, much more than I was expecting, and that's something that I was honestly really impressed by. In regards to cameos in the film, obviously this is the thing I need to be the most tight-lipped about. I think people are expecting for there to be a lot, and yes, I will say there were a lot more than I was expecting. This is not like Multiverse of Madness where people went into that film expecting a cameo fest and they got like 2 minutes of them and they didn't really serve much of a purpose. Here, each one of the cameos, they do serve a narrative purpose of sorts, but my issue really is that they don't, apart from the fact that we know who these characters are, they don't really do a ton with them from a substance perspective, and that really is like my biggest issue with this film, is that I think while there is a lot to enjoy about this film from a fun, you know, from just an entertaining nature and something that you'll really end up just like losing your shit over from a nostalgia perspective, I think substance-wise, there's just some things that don't really end up working out here for me, and the cameos is one of those things where I'm a bit 50-50 with, because I think there's some things that work really well here, there's some really good in-jokes and things like that that I really did enjoy, but there's the other side of it where I think while they do serve a purpose in the story, there's not a lot going on with them character-wise, and that is something that I did have a problem with, because this isn't something where it feels like it's just a quick, you know, 2-minute cameo and then they're gone. No, we actually do linger on them for a little bit longer than I was expecting to, and I thought that that meant they would have a bit more of a purpose character-wise, and they really just ended up not doing all that much other than, oh, I know this character, oh, I know this character, even though they're there for a while. That really is the only purpose that the majority of them serve, and that was a bit disappointing for me, because I think they had an opportunity to do a bit more here, and they really just didn't, and that was something that did very much let me down. I think Marvel has had a real issue lately with trying to, like, recapture what they did well in No Way Home, and they're just kind of recognizing what, you know, they're just kind of taking the wrong lessons from that movie. What works so well about that film is that, yes, you had Andrew and Toby in there, but you also gave them their own sort of narrative conflict that they themselves had to work out. There was a reason why they were in this fight. There was something that both of them were going through, and we really did connect connect with them, not just because we love Andrew and Toby, but also because of the fact that we were latching onto their dilemma in the film, and I think they did a good job with that. And I think since then, they just haven't really been able to recapture the magic, and I think that is something that this film does ultimately struggle with. However, easily my biggest issue with this movie is really just the setup to everything. There are a lot of things that happen in this film that I just have a really hard time buying into, specifically, unfortunately, when it comes to Wade Wilson as a character. I already talked about how much I enjoy Logan's arc and how I think they did a really good job of presenting a different side of him that we haven't seen before. They attempt to do the same with Wade in this movie, but the issue is that the things that Wade wants to do in this film, he's never really expressed doing before it, and to me, the whole thing just feels kind of like a pivot. Like, we're in the MCU now, and because of that, we are now doing something distinctly different with his character than we did before. And the problem is that you can do that and you can make it work, but it has to feel organic. It has to feel like this is something where this is a story that you wanted to tell and you're able to get us there. And maybe, no, you weren't planning to do it from the start, but you have to make it seem like you were trying to do this from the start and that you were trying to get us to this point of, you know, focusing on a different aspect of this character that we haven't seen, and I don't think they really did that here. It does kind of just feel like, because of the fact that now we're in the MCU and we're not a separate entity anymore, now we're just doing a bit of a shift and we're doing something different, and I just had a really hard time in buying into it. Maybe it's just because, again, I like the smaller scale of the first two movies, and again, well, yes, they did go to some crazy places, specifically in the second movie, it still felt a lot more just like kind of like confined to just those set of characters. Here, it really is trying to do something a bit more. It's trying to branch out into different things, and especially when it comes to Wade, I just didn't really buy into his arc in this movie. It also doesn't help that there is a lot of time that has passed since we have last seen Wade Wilson, and the problem is, like, there's a lot of things that have gone down since then that have happened off screen, and because the fact that we have not seen it play out, I just didn't feel as connected. I didn't feel like I was as wrapped up in his character as I was prior. The first two films did a good job of showing the passage of time in a very quick manner, but getting us to fully understand why he's at the point that he is, and I don't think this movie really did that. It is much more focused on trying to get to the good stuff, trying to get to Wolverine, trying to show, you know, their whole, you know, banter throughout the movie. It's so focused on getting there that it really rushes through the things that we need to see, and I feel like it does end up doing the film quite a disservice. So while I think the movie does work as like a tribute to like the Fox universe, and I think it also works as, you know, a really good way to reintroduce Wolverine, I don't really know if it works as a Deadpool movie, and the same goes for, especially when it comes to the previous characters we have seen in the Deadpool films. I mean, besides Peter, who I mentioned, they are almost non-existent in this movie. They are such an afterthought in this film. They do barely anything with the majority of them, and I was just really let down by that. I knew that obviously they weren't going to have the biggest role in this film, but I at least expected for us to maybe cut back to them every so often or have them play somewhat of a role in this film. And while, yes, there is a large part of this conflict that is centered around them, it is more so because we know the bond that Wade has had with them in previous movies. It's not really anything they're doing with them in this film. And it's the same thing with the cameos, where it's like the movie is very contingent upon you caring about these characters from the previous entries and not really doing much to get you to continue to latch onto them in this movie. They really do just feel like an afterthought here, and to me that's very disappointing, because I really do feel like had Deadpool not entered the MCU, they would have done a lot more with these characters. They had a lot more room to grow with them, and the majority of them just don't really do much of anything. Some of them I don't even remember having lines in this movie. So yeah, I was very let down by that aspect of it. I really just feel like, again, it's kind of something I'm conflicted about, because while I think on one hand it works as this really fun sort of buddy comedy, it doesn't really work as a Deadpool movie. I think especially watching the first two before this, which I did, I've watched that as well as every single Wolverine film like prior to this, and I think for Wolverine it worked really well. For Deadpool, it really didn't, because this just feels so separate from what we've gone before. While yes, we are seeing these characters, it just doesn't really feel the same. Yes, it feels the same in terms of like the spirits and like the satirical nature of it all, but from a story perspective, this really just feels like a huge shift, and I don't really know if it fits with what we were setting up prior. There's also no mention of like a Domino or Cable. I at least thought we were going to have some sort of explanation for why they're not in the movie, but there's really none whatsoever. And so, yeah, it really feels like the whole previous two films aren't that important at the end of the day. They are much more focused on establishing what we're doing now and setting up this conflict and getting Deadpool, you know, into the MCU and doing all these different fun things with them. And you can still do that, but you also need to retain what worked before. And I don't think this movie really does end up doing that. I'm going to go back to No Way Home for a second, because yes, that movie did introduce a lot of new elements like the multiverse and the different Spider-Man villains and all these different characters from previous iterations, but it also knew what to focus the movie on. It still had the film mainly be focused on the Peter that we knew and MJ and Ned. And this movie, it doesn't really end up doing that. This film doesn't really work as a continuation of the previous two films. More so, it almost feels like a spin-off of sorts. Like, well, now we have Deadpool and we're going to do something completely different with him than we did in the previous two movies. And that's really what this just feels like, a pivot. And it doesn't feel like a natural one. There's no version of this film, to me, that feels like this is what they were going to do with him before he ended up in the MCU. Instead, it just feels like whatever we were gonna do, fuck that, now whatever we were gonna do before, who cares, now we're doing this. And I feel like you could have honestly done both, and instead the movie just kind of settles for being its own thing, and I really don't think it works as that. I think if you were going to make this like a continuation of the first two Deadpool movies, you need to find a way to also implement those characters that have been in the previous two films and find things to do with them. And aside from Peter, they really don't end up doing that, and I was quite disappointed with that overall. In regards to the villains in this movie, that's another aspect that I don't think works out that well. Cassandra Nova, as a character especially, really just ends up feeling like an afterthought here. When she's in the film, it's very effective. She has a really cool power where she's able to like get inside our characters' heads, and that makes for some of the most emotionally complex moments within the entire film. But I needed more depth to her character. There's a lot of things that are just kind of hinted at, and they don't really fully lean into it, and I just felt that she was just very one-dimensional by the end of it. There was a point where I honestly kind of forgot she was in the movie because they don't really do a ton with her. There are some really effective moments, but I think a lot of it, like I said, is due more to Corrin's performance than it really is due to the character. And then Mr. Paradox overall, again, I feel for the most part is pretty one-note. He does have a mission of his own, but it just doesn't feel like we dive enough into that. And there are significant, even more so than Cassandra, there are significant portions of this film where he really isn't even around, and it feels like both of them are like competing for screen time for who is supposed to be like the real like overarching villain of the film. It honestly is kind of hard to tell, you know, where they're really going, and I think they really just needed to find a way to balance both of these characters, because it really does feel like neither of them are that satisfying of villains by the end of it, and I think they could have done a better job. The setup as well to like Wade going on this mission, I think again was just a little bit wonky to me. I didn't really like the way, so that was another aspect that just didn't really end up working out. My only other issue is that while I think the majority of this film really does work in terms of comedy, and trust me, this is one of those films where it's like there's comedy like every millisecond, to the point where there are things that you probably will miss and it'll warrant a second viewing just so you can watch back the joke that you missed because you were laughing so hard at what happened before. When it comes to the character of Dogpool, I just wasn't really into it that much. I thought that it got Some of the comedy doesn't really land as much as I was hoping for, particularly when it comes to Dogpool. Anytime they cut back to him, anytime they cut back to that character, I just wasn't really into what they were doing. I thought it was just extremely repetitive and really overused in a way that I wasn't expecting. There are just some jokes here that just feel very overused and repetitive, and I think that is something else that does bring the movie down. So while I was laughing pretty hard, there's some jokes that just didn't land quite as much as I was hoping for. From a creativity perspective, I think this film actually does work really well. There's a lot of different iterations of Deadpool that we get to see. There's a lot of different things they do with the timeline hopping and things like that. All of that is really well thought out, and I thought they did put a lot of effort into that side of things. There's this really great recurring gag involving one of the Deadpools that I'm not going to say, but I thought it worked out really well, and I really like the way they ended up leaning into that. So I think from that side of things, it does work out really well. Overall, it's a screenplay where I think there's a lot of things that do end up working out, but there are just a lot of story things here that just ended up really hurting the film for me quite drastically. And I think considering this film, it wants to be something really grand and epic, it doesn't really reach those heights when the story itself just feels very underwritten in quite a few aspects. And while this is a movie that you might go into and think it's hard to talk about without spoilers, it honestly ends up being a lot more simplistic from a story perspective than you are expecting. Like I said, it's way more of this like buddy comedy of sorts, and the comedy really does end up helping the movie because it is one of those films where if you are not laughing at what's going on and you're focusing too much on the plot, it is going to be something that doesn't really quite end up working out for you. And for me, I mean, I'm someone that I need both things to be just as strong, and that's why I don't think this film is quite on the level in the way that I was hoping it to. I was hoping, while yes, it had really strong comedy, that it also would have some really grounded and some really effective character moments, and I think it does for Wolverine. It's just when it comes to Deadpool and some other things, it doesn't quite deliver as much as I was hoping for, and that was definitely something that did disappoint me a bit. When it comes to the cinematography in this film, I think this is an area where the film really does end up delivering. A lot of people have talked about this one location they're in and how sort of bland it is and things like that, and I won't disagree. Yes, it isn't quite as visually appealing as maybe you're hoping, but when the film isn't in that location, I mean, it is something that you really can't take your eyes off of. There's this and I think they do a really good job with that. I really enjoyed a lot of the locations that they come across in this movie. I think that they do a really good job of diving into that, but also playing around with the different iterations of these characters. I think also it's just really well done. That's something else that I thought worked really well. It's kind of similar to like something they wanted Multiverse of Madness to do. They definitely do play a lot more into the idea of the multiverse, and I thought that they did do a really good job with that here. From an action perspective, I mean, this is one of the areas where I don't think they have missed a single beat. In fact, I think this might have the best action in the entire franchise. I mean, whether it's the opening scene of this film, which is just so incredibly relentless and went in some truly insane directions that I didn't even think they were capable of doing, and I thought was just crazily done. But I just really loved every second of it. It is every bit as bloody as you want, and my God, when we're talking from a violence and carnage perspective, this might be the most graphic of the three we have had. There is so much blood that is spilled, so many bodies flying everywhere. I mean, the film really holds nothing back in that regard, but I think probably my favorite action scene involves this like tracking shot of this one take tracking shot of sorts that they do. It is very reminiscent of what we got in Guardians 3. I don't think it's quite on the level of that, but it still is really fun to watch. And of course, seeing these two just duking it out as well, that's one of the big things that people came to see, and it really does deliver in that way. And I think on an action perspective, I mean, this film just really ends up going for it, and that's something I was definitely very impressed by. It's some of the most fluid action I think we've seen in the MCU in quite a bit, and easily some of the most memorable as well. The score as well, I also really did enjoy in this movie. Rob Simonson's score, I really did enjoy the way that he was able to add this sort of like more grand and epic feel to the film. I really did enjoy, particularly the score that plays every time like something really major happens in the film. I really did enjoy that. And the soundtrack, that's always been an aspect of these Deadpool films that has always been a pretty consistently, strong element. And this is probably, if we're talking soundtrack-wise, probably my favorite of the ones that they have done. Every song here I really do like a lot, but I will say, I think sometimes it is a little bit overbearing. There are times where they have music play, and it doesn't really feel like it's necessary for it to happen. There's some moments here that just didn't really quite work, but when they hit, they really do hit, particularly in the opening scene. I really like the song that they ended up using there. There's this really great montage of sorts, and the song they used with that I thought worked really well. The fight scene that I alluded to, that's like, this tracking shot of sorts, I thought that was really well done. So I think for the most part, the soundtrack does work. There's just sometimes where it does feel like a little bit, there's a bit of an overabundance of it, but I think when it works, it really does work well. And the editing, this is another aspect that I was honestly kind of conflicted by. I think the movie is well paced for the most part, but I do think the first 30 to 40 minutes of this film are extremely rushed. They really are just, like I said, trying to just dive head first into what we want to see. There's some rushed explanations for why things are happening, and a lot of just exposition that feels like it needed a lot more time for us to really just dive into all of it and soak everything in. And I think the film really would have benefited from at least being like 15 to 20 minutes longer. I don't really understand why it couldn't have been. I think that they easily could have done that, but instead it's only like a little over 2 hours, and I think as a result there's just some things that just feel a little bit rushed and underdeveloped. And I think if they had spent a bit more time on things, because there's a lot they're trying to do in this movie, obviously I understand that, but I think if they had spent a bit more time on things, I think it would have been that much more satisfying overall. While it can feel a bit bogged down at points, and I do think there are quite a few things story-wise that just don't really end up working out for me, ultimately Deadpool and Wolverine is just a really fun time. If you're coming to this movie to see these two characters duke it out, but also get to really, banter as well as understand each other, I think the movie does a really great job with that. Hugh Jackman and Reynolds just really end up delivering in spades in the way that you're really hoping them to. The action sequences are maybe the best of this entire franchise. There's some really good character development specifically for Wolverine, and really just diving deeper into his plight and things like that, with a character that we really haven't seen before, and I think they do a good job with that. But it also ends up working as sort of this love letter of sorts to the Fox universe that no longer exists, and kind of, being this closeout, and I think, and kind of being this, ode of sorts, and I think, and kind of being this, like, sort of tribute of sorts, and I think it does do a really good job with that. It does retain a lot of the wits as well as the satirical nature that the previous films did do. It might not be quite as sharp in some areas, and I do think that it would have benefited from a longer runtime, as well as a little bit more of a focus on some of the things that worked in the previous two films. But for what this is, I think this film really does end up delivering, and while there definitely were some things I wish it could have done a little bit better, and I don't think this is nearly like the big, the big, like, cinematic achievement that's going to turn the entire MCU around. I think for what it is, it really is just a really fun ride that ends up delivering on the things that you wanted to, and I think if that's really what you came to the movie for, I think you will overall be satisfied. For me, I think it is, in terms of the Deadpool movies, probably the weakest one of the bunch, but it's still a film that I can say I had a grand old time with. I really just enjoyed watching all of this go down, and as long as Ryan Reynolds continues to be on board, I will, as long as Ryan Reynolds continues to have really fun ideas for this character, I don't know what the future holds moving forward, but whatever it is, I will definitely be on board, because I just really have enjoyed what he's done in these three movies. And despite the fact that while I don't think this film is quite on the level of the first two, it still really did end up winning me over by the end of it all. It delivers in the sense of the comedy, in the sense of expanding the multiverse, some really great cameos, some really fun banter between the two characters, some absolutely kinetic and just really grisly action sequences, as well as some really surprisingly very deep character development, specifically for Wolverine. Overall, I think this film does deliver in the way that you are hoping it to. So with that said, I am going to give Deadpool and Wolverine a B-. But over, guys, to my review of Deadpool and Wolverine. Let me know what you guys thought of this movie overall. Lift your thoughts, and we'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.